Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And of course, this is...
Murder Coaster.
When punk rock landed in Los Angeles in the 1970s with bands like the Screamers, the Weirdos, and Nervous Gender, it was artistic, weird, theatrical, open to interpretation, welcoming the straight, queer, and androgynous, inspired as much by David Bowie, Lou Reed, and Devo as it was by the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. But as the sound grew harder and faster, and the end of the 70s saw the emergence of hardcore, with bands like Black Flag and Fear, it became more and more violent and intolerant. Bands became more like gangs than musicians, with suicidal tendencies representing Venice Beach and True Sons of Liberty, Huntington Beach. And as hardcore punk became influenced by the culture of Chicano gangs, it became something right out of A Clockwork Orange, with sociopathic teens searching the night for ultraviolence and murder, with gang names like something out of the Warriors, Pig Children Tribe, Los Angeles Death Squad, Circle One Family, Fight for Freedom. And by the mid-1980s, punk rock in Los Angeles had moved from an artistic movement to one of the most violent and deadliest youth subcultures on the planet. And no one seems to represent this more than Frank the Shank, a murdering psychopath that appears one part legend and one part myth. Today we bring you the story of the punk rock gangs of Los Angeles and the terrifying punk rock murderer and gangbanger, Frank the Shank.
Let's begin. Prologue. We got the Neutron bomb, Screamers, Weirdos, and Germs. A decade before punk rock would rear its misbegotten head, the spirit and themes of the coming movement would be perfectly summed up by a young Los Angeles rock star named Jim Morrison, who said,
I've always been attracted to ideas that were about revolt against authority. I like ideas about the breaking away or overthrowing of established order. I am interested in anything about revolt, disorder, chaos, especially activities that seem to have no meaning. The world we suggest is of a new Wild West, a sensuous, evil world.
Los Angeles in the mid-70s was ripe for a new subculture. The underground was hungry. Glitter and glam rock had come and gone under the auspices of Rodney Bingenheimer, who'd been the center of the scene with his English disco club, which he ran, in part, with David Bowie.
Rock and roll had become some ungainly monster, with 20-minute guitar solos, soft, overproduced, and boring bands like Fleetwood Mac, Jackson Browne, and Captain and Tennille, who were in constant rotation on the radio. The Los Angeles underground craved something darker, harder, and tougher, something dangerous and pure.
Iggy Pop relocated to Los Angeles, struggling to survive. His album Raw Power had been released in 1973, but had failed commercially and been panned by critics, causing him to be dropped by his label.
But now, a couple years later, the album Raw Power was gaining traction in the underground. Young kids like Paul Beam and George Rothenberg, who'd later be known as Darby Crash and Pat Smear, founders of the Germs, discovered the album in a discount bin and were attracted to the dark horror movie look of it. And songs like Search and Destroy would become blueprints for punk and hardcore, eventually earning Iggy the moniker, the godfather of punk.
In this burbling pre-punk scene of Los Angeles, as glam rock died, from the notorious Kim Fowley came the Runaways, an aggressive teenage all-girl band with short and simple rock songs, full of grit and venom. Guitarist Joan Jett with spiky black hair and a black leather biker jacket, the quintessential proto-punk.
In 1976, the Runaways went on tour with a band from Queens, New York, that had come to epitomize this new, rugged, tough, brash sound, becoming known as punk rock, the Ramones.
The Ramones and the Runaways sowed the seeds of punk rock like black leather-clad Johnny Appleseeds, going from CBGBs in New York City to London. And it's said that when the Ramones played in England, every person in the audience formed a band, and so came the creation of The Clash and The Damned and a thriving and distinctly English punk culture that we still see today.
And back in Los Angeles, radio station KROQ brought Rodney Bingenheimer in as a DJ, and as he said,
"They wanted me to play glam rock, but as soon as I went on the air in August of 1976, I went right into punk. The first thing I played was the Ramones."
This radio show, Rodney on the Rock, would be taped and traded, coming to influence countless musicians, from Keith Morris to Courtney Love, and be indispensable in helping form the burgeoning Los Angeles punk movement of the 70s.
Infamous scenester and band manager Kim Fowley, who'd been the one who'd created the Runaways, held a run of shows in 1976 at the Whiskey A Go-Go on the Sunset Strip, called Kim Fowley Presents Punk Rock. Though, honestly, what punk rock was hadn't even coalesced and formed yet. It could be anything, as long as it was weird and had an element of the outlandish and dangerous. A mix of Rocky Horror Picture Show and 1950s juvenile delinquents, often fluorescent and colorful.
More so-called punk shows followed, including a legendary show at the Orpheum headlined by the Damned from London. The London punks were all the rage at the time, as the Sex Pistols had just made international news for swearing on live television.
Some of the bands that were playing at this time, the genesis of Los Angeles punk rock, were Venus and the Razorblades, teenagers whose music was said to be a combination of Kiss and ABBA, hardly what we'd call punk rock today. The Screamers, which had been a more or less queer performance art group called Tupperware in Seattle before moving to Los Angeles, changing their name and wearing ripped clothing and spiked hair. The Weirdos, an art school band who wrapped themselves in plastic wrap and trash bags, and a band which had been called Sophistifuck, and the Revlon Spam Queens, but changed their name to the Germs, who couldn't play their instruments and instead smeared peanut butter and lunch meat on themselves. As Kim Fowley would say,
"You get a donkey and you get a baboon, and you feed them a diet of chili and custard for 30 days, and then you get them to fuck. Their children would be the Germs."
But though their short, nihilistic, cult-like moment would only last a few years, the Germs would go on to not only learn how to play their instruments, but become one of the most legendary and influential punk bands in the world. their sound key to the formation of hardcore and grunge, guitarist Pat Smear later playing with Nirvana.
And there was pre-goth poet Exene and her Hank Williams-loving bass player boyfriend John Doe, who hooked up with a rockabilly guitarist and carny Billy Zoom to form X, making quintessentially American rock and roll with a look, vibe, and attitude that came to define the early Los Angeles punk movement.
Then, in 1977, dead center in the heart of Hollywood, a young Scottish fellow named Brendan Mullen started a club in a graffiti-covered maze of basements called The Mask that would become the home and heartbeat of this strange conglomeration of misfits and outsiders, giving them a base and place to practice, including a green-haired girl named Belinda Carlisle and her band, the Go-Go's. Yes, the Go-Go's, who'd go on to be top 40 pop icons with their songs We Got the Beat, Vacation, and Our Lips Are Sealed. They were originally a gritty Hollywood punk band. Melinda had even briefly played drums for the Germs.
Quick side note, one of the first victims of the Hillside Stranglers was a young punker girl named Judith Miller, who hung out at the Mask and actually had been there the night she was killed, Halloween 1977. And for a while, homicide detectives thought the killer might be a punk rocker. Of course, they couldn't have been more wrong.
And this vibrant, weird, sometimes queer Hollywood scene was documented by the punk zine Slash, which would later become an underground record label producing many of the early bands.
Then in 1978, a new band came on the scene, Fear, who immediately set themselves apart by being harder and faster than the other bands, with a distinctly heavy metal edge. They were also a band that wasn't afraid to fight and use their fists.
And while the early LA scene had evolved from the glam and glitter of the early 70s, inspired by the weirdness and androgynous bisexuality of David Bowie and Lou Reed, and there were plenty of queer punks, even tough guy Darby Crash being gay, though few knew it, Fear thought it would be funny to yell homophobic slurs at the audience, thinking it obviously ironic since guitarist Philo Kramer was wearing a dress.
Some got the joke, some didn't. But bubbling below the surface of this weird art and music movement, a new intolerant and mean-spirited form of punk was sprouting. Tough, cold, and bleak, macho and testosterone-fueled, without the artiness and philosophical introspection of the early scene. Violent, nasty, intolerant, homophobic, and misogynist. Fluorescent colors were out, and black was in.
And down in Hermosa Beach, a thriving punk scene was developing as well, fronted by a band named Panic that would change its name to Black Flag and come to define the hyper-aggressive and nihilistic sound that would become hardcore.
And this was the world of Los Angeles punk rock as 1978 came to a close, and a young, budding sociopathic hoodlum and future murderer named Frank came onto the scene, his love of hardcore and punk being what would eventually destroy the movement. And before we go any further, I just want to say, besides loving the music that came from this time and place, being a huge fan of Black Flag, Social Distortion, The Descendants, Agent Orange, X, The Germs, Circle Jerks, and so many other bands, we have to say we have no connection to the Los Angeles punk rock movement at all. We were not there. If we get anything wrong, it wasn't intentional. We're just storytellers. As always, all of our resources are in the show notes, but our main sources are the oral history books, We Got the Neutron Bomb, The Untold History of Los Angeles Punk, compiled by Marc Spitz, and American Hardcore, A Tribal History, compiled by Stephen Blush and George Petros, both of which are fantastic and must-reads for any fans of this music, as well as the first-person memoir, This Goes Out, Murders In, the true story of Frank the Shank and LA's deadliest punk rock gang, as told to Heath Mattioli and David Spiccone. And now, without further ado, on with the show and the story of the infamous and terrifying Frank the Shank.
Chapter 1. Little Frankie.
Frank, last name unknown, who would become known as Frank the Shank, was born October 4th, 1967. His father was Italian and had been involved with the mafia in Detroit, but had to flee to Los Angeles in 1960 after beating up a cop, settling down in the city of La Mirada, right between East LA and Orange County, what they call a gateway city, a bridge between Los Angeles and Orange County, convenient because Frank's father worked in trucking for Sam Sciartino, underboss of the LA Mafia.
Frank's father was an abusive drunk who regularly beat him for any infraction, perceived or otherwise. He'd also beat Frank under the pretense of teaching him how to fight, saying his father had done the same thing to him, dragging him out into the backyard when he was just a child and pummeling him, creating a resentful, tough, and angry kid, ripe for violence.
Teaching him to fight, Frank's father would jut out his chin and say, "Here, free shot." And when Frank would swing at him, he'd duck and counter with an underhanded gut punch, knocking little Frank to the ground, then loom over him and say, "Let that be a lesson. There's no mercy. None."
One beating sent Frank to the hospital with a bruised rib and a couple stitches. When they asked what happened to him, he just told them he'd fallen off his bike.
But at 12 years old, Frank was a pretty average Southern California kid. He had that late 70s shaggy hair, a skateboard, saving up money to buy a BMX bike. He played in the Little League, where he says he was a champion baseball player.
1978 had been a year of horror and depressing facts for America. The dollar was at an all-time low. In Chicago, the bodies of 29 boys were found in the basement of killer clown John Wayne Gacy. 909 followers of preacher Jim Jones committed suicide or were murdered. Serial killer Ted Bundy was captured in Florida.
But now it was 1979, and little Frank was wandering the aisles of a record store called the Magic Mushroom. As he says, checking out the hot chicks on album covers with their satin pants and high heels.
As Frank flipped through the records of Donna Summer, Rod Stewart, the Bee Gees, he noticed someone walking in and realized with a shock it was his older neighbor Marla.
Frank couldn't believe his eyes. She looked like an alien from another planet, but was also sexy as hell. She'd bleached her hair, was wearing torn fishnet stockings, motorcycle boots, and strange makeup. And she was with a guy with a foot-tall spiked mohawk.
Frank shyly asked her how it was going, and she blew him off at first. But when he asked her what records she was listening to, she lightened up, saying, "The only records. Sex Pistols, Black Flag, The Germs."
"What's that?" Frank asked.
"Punk music. It's all that matters. Throw everything else away."
Frank grumbled that he was too broke to buy any records, and Marla told him she'd loan him some, but he better not fucking scratch them.
Marla loaned Frank Black Flag's Nervous Breakdown, the Sex Pistols, Nevermind the Bollocks, and the Germs' GI.
The music was explosive. It felt dangerous. They were screaming and cursing, saying politics was all a sham, that the world was trash and they were tired of being shit on by society. He loved them.
Then he discovered Rodney Bingenheimer's radio show and started taping every episode, trading them at school with other kids who'd discovered this crazy new music.
Then Frank and a couple friends decided to take the big plunge and shave their heads.
Surprisingly, this was a big deal back then in the late 70s. Everyone had long hair. It was just the look.
Yeah, and it's so bizarre that just 10 years earlier, in the 60s, if you had long hair, you were an outcast freak. And now to come full circle, to have your head shaved made you a freak.
They set the electric razor to 1/4 of an inch, Johnny Rotten short, giving themselves a spiky, ultra-short look.
When Frank walked in the door with his hair shaved off, his father screamed, "Grow your hair back or join the Marines, you fucking loser," and threw a can of beer at his head, knocking him right off his feet.
The news had recently been full of reports of how Sid Vicious had overdosed on heroin and died, and Frank's father saw all punks as lazy, druggy scum.
But Frank refused to grow his hair out, despite getting a few beatdowns over it. Now, it was a matter of resistance and pride.
And it wasn't just his father who responded with violence. The late 70s was just a violent time period. All kinds of long-haired teenagers hassled him and jumped him, from metalheads and heshers to surfers, Ted Nugent and Kiss fans, rednecks, jocks, and cowboys. They all saw his shaved head as some sort of threat and menace.
And this is a story I've heard time and time again. Punks learning to defend themselves after being attacked. Everyone from Ian MacKaye and Henry Rollins in Washington, D.C., to that skinhead kid Eugene in the documentary Decline of the Western Civilization, to Mike Ness of Social Distortion. If you wanted to be punk back then, you just had to learn to fight, because assholes would jump you. And since there's strength in numbers, you had to find a group of other punks to hang out with and fight back with, which is how the punk rock gangs started.
Chapter 2. X at the Whiskey.
On Thanksgiving 1979, Frank was resentfully sitting at the kids' table when his older cousins Janet and Faye walked in the door, and he couldn't believe it. They'd gone punk. Janet had dyed her hair jet black, Faye platinum blonde, and they were wearing leather jackets and combat boots.
They looked at his shaved head and smiled. Nice hair. Bet Mom and Dad were thrilled.
Frank asked them if they went to punk rock concerts, and they sneered.
They're called gigs, and yes, we do.
Oh, please take me with you. Please, please. I don't want to be a poser. All I listen to are the Germs, Black Flag, and Rodney on the Rock.
His cousins were amused and decided it would be cute to bring a little shaved head kid to a punk show, so they let him come along when they went to see X at the Whiskey A Go-Go.
It was Frank's first time going to Hollywood. Cruising down Sunset Boulevard, they drank beers and smoked a joint. Frank staring bright-eyed out the window at the bright lights, neon, and freaks Hollywood sign in the hills, all tattered and falling apart. Then they were being shuffled inside the whiskey, for free, since his cousins knew the bouncers.
The first thing Frank noticed was the range of ethnicities. There were black folks, Asians, Mexicans, whites, an equal mix. To quote him,
I found a movement based on togetherness. We were all the same tribe. Color, race, and religion meant nil.
When X hit the stage and everyone started pogoing, Frank was in ecstasy. The energy, the wildness, it was amazing. He felt like a real punk rocker now, no longer a poser little kid.
This is just before slam dancing, moshing, and stage diving, when everyone just pogoed, jumping up and down, and others rolled on the floor, twitching like they were having a seizure, a dance they called the worm. It looked chaotic, but it was all pretty peaceful and fun. If someone fell down, they were quickly picked up. Everyone looked out for each other. All of that would soon change.
Janet and Faye took Frank to all kinds of punk shows all over Los Angeles and Orange County. Madame Wong's, The Hideaway, The Cuckoo's Nest, The Anti-Club, even taking him backstage to meet the bands. 12-year-old little Frank hanging out with the Dead Kennedys and the Circle Jerks.
Chapter 3, 1980.
Then Frank's parents separated and his father moved out. And with his mother working all day, there was no parental control. And he dove into punk rock headlong, hanging out on the streets of Hollywood, chilling in the famous punk squat Hotel Hell behind the Chinese Theater, panhandling on Hollywood Boulevard where street punks would charge tourists to have their picture taken with them.
When he wasn't running wild in Hollywood, Frank would often hang out at the Skate City skateboard park on Telegraph Boulevard in Whittier, where he encountered a terrifying punk rock kid named Santino, who'd named himself after the eldest brother in the Godfather movie. Santino was crazy tough. Though he was only 16, he was 6 foot tall, 200 pounds, and a seasoned street fighter and sadist who liked to inflict pain.
La Mirada and Whittier are on the edge of East Los Angeles, where a long history of vatos and a culture of cholo gangs existed, dating all the way back to the 1930s.
Santino's father, whom they called the Godfather, was involved with the cholo gang CV3, or Compton Barrio Trace. CV3 had tried to recruit Santino, but Santino didn't want to be a cholo or be a soldier in someone else's gang. He wanted to be a punk rocker, and he wanted to have his own gang. So he decided to form his own punk rock gang, LMP, or La Mirada Punks.
Having an actual gang was also a way to fight off the long hairs that were constantly hassling the punk rockers.
There in La Mirada, they established their main turf as the regional pool, which had been emptied by the city and abandoned, and now was a place to skateboard. They tagged it heavy, spray painting LMP everywhere, establishing it as their territory.
Two of the most notorious members of this new punk gang were a guy named Sailor, who'd get so drunk he seemed to sail away, and a guy named Joker.
Sailor was 6'4" and 280 pounds. Crazy as hell.
And since the punks were constantly a target for bullies, jocks, and rednecks, other punk gangs were forming to protect themselves as well. One of the most famous being the Los Angeles Death Squad, or LADS, known for dressing in all black with skull and crossbones armbands and fedora hats.
Then there was Vicious Circle Gang in Long Beach, who named themselves after the notoriously violent band Jack Grisham had before starting True Sounds of Liberty, or TSOL.
And there was Circle One Family, which was basically both a band and a kind of Christian cult named after a Germs song.
Circle One leader John Macias was a legendary figure in the early days of hardcore. Of Puerto Rican descent and absolutely huge, ripped and muscular, menacing and fearless. He was known for defending punks, breaking up fights, preaching unity, and being a born-again Christian. His followers, or gang members, wore white long-sleeve button-up shirts with tails and had the band's insignia on the arm. And these followers were known to sometimes cause a lot of trouble. They had a strange reputation for preaching unity, but simultaneously causing a lot of fights. But it was just a violent time in general.
While preaching unity and Christian values, skinhead John Macias also suffered from mental illness and is thought to have been schizophrenic. Eventually, on May 30th, 1991, in a psychotic episode, John would go to the end of the Santa Monica Pier and, while screaming about God, began grabbing people and throwing them off and into the water. When police arrived on the scene, seeing this huge, raving mad skinhead, they panicked and shot him 4 times, tragically killing him.
Strangely, his death would inspire the Michael Douglas movie Falling Down. So bizarre because John Macias was a Puerto Rican skinhead street fighter, and the guy in the movie is an archetypal white-collar straight guy. But they both die on the Santa Monica Pier, and I guess they were both Christian, too.
And there was also the Suicidal Tendencies gang from Venice Beach, headed by the band's lead singer, Mike Muir. Suicidal Tendencies really embraced the cholo look, wearing bandanas low on their foreheads, covering their eyes, flannel shirts with only the top buttons buttoned, baseball hats with the brims turned upward. The gang that formed around them was notorious and went by many names: Suis, Suicidal Psychos, and would inspire splinter gangs like Suicidal Samoans.
When I was just a little kid in Baltimore County, Maryland in the early and mid-'80s, I had the first Suicidal Tendencies record, and man did I love it. Just fantastic early thrash hardcore, the best to skate to. And on the album cover were all these different homemade shirts, and I, of course, made my own as well. Cool skulls and this distinctive lettering. I had absolutely no idea that I was wearing gang clothing, basically the equivalent of wearing colors or throwing gang hand signs. And that in certain places, I could have been beaten up or even stabbed or even shot for wearing that stuff. It's fucking crazy.
And as the bands became more aggressive, tougher, meaner, the music changing from punk rock to hardcore, the dancing changed as well. Doing the worm and rolling on the floor could lead you to getting trampled. Now the kids were skanking, a dance started in reggae and ska, where you kind of march, cocking your elbows and knees, but they were slamming into each other as they did it, marching in a circle or a pit.
And kids were now climbing up onto the stage and leaping off, or stage diving, throwing themselves atop the packed, sweaty crowd, absolute mayhem and anarchy, and my absolute favorite way to let off steam and have fun as a teenager. I absolutely fucking loved that shit.
But it was all too much for the original Hollywood crowd who'd started the movement 4 years earlier. All the artists and philosophers and intellectuals and queers were being pushed out of the scene, which began to resonate more in Orange County now, in particular at a club in Costa Mesa called the Cuckoo's Nest, said by some to be the birthplace of slam dancing.
Slash magazine, which had documented the early years, folded. Iconic writer Kickboy Face heading back to Europe. And as the scene became more aggressive and violent and intolerant, the girls were fleeing as well. While the Los Angeles punk scene had been heralded by the all-girl group, the Runaways, followed by the Go-Go's, and of course there was X-Scene from X, and Alicia Armendariz, and Patricia Morrison of the Bags. Now it was nearly all guys, many of whom had been jocks who'd hated punks and started the fights years earlier, which led to the formation of the gangs and violence. And now they were the gangs. They'd become the people they were defending themselves against. a strange, twisted spiral.
And now, instead of punk gangs fighting the long hairs and jocks who tormented them, and were the reason the gangs had formed to begin with, the gangs were fighting each other.
Okie Dog in West Hollywood was a hot dog stand famous for being a gathering place of punks after shows, where Darby Crash and the Germs would often hold court. Now the area was becoming a place where rival punk gangs fought.
Frank, still just a kid on the outskirts of the scene, was at Okie Dog one night with his cousins, Janet and Faye, when he saw the LMP gang from his neighborhood show up. And 6'4", 280-pound Sailor stuffed Tony Sedina, lead singer of the Adolescents, who was said to be tough as nails, into a garbage can and sat on top of it, trapping him inside.
Janet and Faye were disgusted by it. They hated all the violence, especially punk-on-punk violence. It wasn't what the movement was about, what it was meant to be. But Frank was intrigued and thought to himself, well, I want that guy on my side.
Then on December 7th, 1980, a great tragedy befell the Hollywood punk scene as Darby Crash committed suicide by purposely overdosing on heroin, going out like his hero Sid Vicious.
In a sadly ironic twist, it was the very same day that John Lennon was shot dead in New York City, which completely overshadowed the tragic death of this early punk luminary.
This story was, after a hiatus, the Germs had reunited and just played their greatest show yet. And afterwards, it was said that Darby had booked the show with the sole purpose of securing enough money to buy enough heroin to kill himself.
It was the true end of the first wave of LA punk, devastating the scene. Punk was over. Hardcore now reigned.
Chapter 4, 1982.
It was at the La Mirada swap meet that young Frank would get to know the infamous LMP brawler Sailor, who was there with an electric razor, giving punk haircuts for $10 each.
When Frank told Sailor there was a punk show that night at the Palladium, Sailor asked for a ride and rode to the show with Frank's friend Gary in the back of his pickup truck, hanging off the tailgate on the highway, swilling beers and chucking the empty cans at passing cars.
At the show, little Frank, who just turned 13, impressed the massive older Sailor with his toughness in the slam pit, and the two became pals of sorts.
The next day, Frank was out skateboarding when a car full of punks pulled up to him in a black chopped 71 Lincoln, exactly like the homicidal vehicle in the made-for-TV horror movie, The Car.
I remember that movie. Classic.
Inside, driving, was a lady named Sickness. Beside her in the passenger seat was a tall, gangly guy in black leather named Vitamin Ina.
They were in the band Youth Gone Mad, and in the back seat was the president of their fan club, a girl named Donna the Dead, which is one of the greatest punk names I've ever heard.
They were all members of the LMP gang, and Donna the Dead had a terrifying reputation as being one of the hardest street-fighting girls around.
They offered him a ride, and Frank jumped in and ended up becoming good friends with the band, spending a lot of time watching them practice. And soon he and Donna the Dead were a couple, more or less, though he was 4 years younger than her.
Interesting side note here. Eventually, Vitamin Ina, real name Paul Kostobi, would move the band to New York City, where he'd meet an art school student named Robert Cummings. and they'd start a band called White Zombie. Robert Cummings eventually changing his name to Rob Zombie. Big fan, big fan.
Hell yeah. Frank was now in with Youth Gone Mad, and they'd all pile into the spooky Lincoln, which had license plates reading Mr. 666. And they'd run around Hollywood causing chaos and hanging out at Okie Dog.
Then Frank met a kid his own age named Youngblood. The names in this, man, talk about...
Just gets better.
Yeah. Who was also a member of the LMP gang, his older brother Boxer being one of the OG members and a notorious street fighter.
Even though Youngblood was only 14, he had a 68 Oldsmobile, and the two began joyriding through Los Angeles, causing trouble.
Frank was now in with lots of LMP members, who'd all been secretly keeping their eye on him, and one day, hanging out in Youngblood's bedroom listening to records, in walked the leader of the gang, Santino, with Boxer and Joker.
You know the rules if you're gonna keep hanging out, snarled Santino as the gang members circled Frank.
Frank stood and raised his fists, and they attacked him, beating him to the ground and kicking him unconscious.
When Frank awakened on the floor, groggy, bruised, and battered, they all cheered and handed him a beer. He'd been jumped in. Frank was now an official member of the LMP gang. He was 13 years old.
Chapter 5. Gang Member. Now that he was a gang member, it was seen as beneath him to be spare changing on the streets of Hollywood, or charging tourists to take photographs with him. He had a reputation to protect. Instead, he started mugging gay men looking to pick up male prostitutes.
Since Frank was young, he'd lure them into an alley where other gang members would jump them. One LMP member named Barney would joyfully beat any gay man with a baseball bat for no reason at all. Just for the thrill of it. And the police didn't care.
In an ultimate irony, Los Angeles punk rock had become intolerant of gays. A movement started by Tamara Duplanty of the Screamers and Darby Crash of the Germs, both of whom were gay. The Screamers, originally a queer theater art project called Tupperware.
So sad. So sad. But there was amazing music being made that summer of 1981. That cannot be denied. Some of the legendary bands Frank saw coming through Los Angeles were the Bad Brains, The Clash, Crass, Discharge, The Exploited, Generation X, JFA, MDC, Minor Threat, Agent Orange, Cockney Rejects, Bad Religion, Black Flag, Circle Jerks, Dead Kennedys, The Descendants, and The Misfits. Whoa.
But often Frank wasn't even able to enjoy this incredible music that defined a generation and is still treasured today. As a gang member, when he arrived at a show, the first thing he had to do was check in with the gang, find the highest-ranking member, then, more often than not, stand off to the side, putting on a mad dog face and preparing for a gang fight.
The ultraviolence just kept increasing, becoming something right out of A Clockwork Orange. One night, a mod drove by on a scooter, and for some reason, these guys hated mods, which were the precursors to rude boys and skinheads, a look I adore. Pork pie hat, creeper shoes.
They jumped him and stole his scooter, and for no reason at all, stabbed him to death. And as Frank sat there watching this innocent mod kid bleed out in a dirty Hollywood alley, he was tickled by it, and says that what set him and his crew apart from the other punk gangs was that they saw murder as no different than a fistfight.
Youngblood got into a fight with a rival gang called DYG in La Mirada and ended up stabbing one of the members, getting arrested, and being sent off to juvenile hall for a year. And with him gone, Little Frank was the gang's new mascot, and rising star.
Frank started spending time with the gang leader, Santino, and the old-school Cholo gang CV3, which was affiliated with Santino's father, whom they all called the Godfather.
These old-school Chicano gangbangers wanted to see what this punk rock thing was all about, and Frank started taking them to shows with him, pulling up to punk venues in a lowrider Eldorado with all these vatos locos.
And according to Frank, all of this led LMP to become the most notorious and feared punk rock gang in Southern California. Though, as we'll later see, some dispute this.
And as if to put a surreal nail in the coffin of the 1976 punk movement, the Go-Go's had gone completely pop, firing bassist Margot Oliveria for being too punk, and their album Beauty and the Beat had gone to #1 on the Billboard 200, buoyed by their hit song, We Got the Beat. They were on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine as pop divas, eschewing any sign of ever having been punk rockers, and marketing themselves to the soulless consumer culture which the original punks had hated so much and been rebelling against to begin with.
Chapter 6. Oi, oi, oi!
And a new movement was sweeping across the hardcore punk scene. Oi.
Oh, oi. Oi was a harder, tougher version of skinhead music coming out of England, a culture which had originally evolved from Jamaican rude boy immigrants who listened to ska and reggae. Now it was a more stripped-down, militant look. Gone were the fedoras and sports jackets and sunglasses. Now it was flight jackets, Doc Martens, thin suspenders they called braces, red Perry polo shirts, and blue jeans splashed with bleach.
And instead of quarter-inch shaved hair, it was now completely bald. And there was very little, if any, ska influence in the music. It was raw, no more horn section, sounding more like British drinking songs, with bands like Strike, Info Riot, Criminal Class, and songs like Gang Warfare, We Outnumber You, and Blood on the Streets.
Although they still referred to themselves as punks, LMP adopted this modern skinhead look and dove into the senseless violence with reckless abandon.
LMP was aligned with the Lads, or Los Angeles Death Squad, and they would often fight together. And they were both in constant conflict with the Suicidal Gang, whom they called Suies, like a farmer would call a pig. Suey, suey, suey.
In a 1982 article in Penthouse magazine on the new ultra-violent punk scene entitled Slam Dancing in a Fast City, Mike Muir of Suicidal Tendencies was interviewed and said,
"You're not going out there to have a party. You're gonna hurt someone, and you know it. I go crazy. I don't care. I just want to fucking kill somebody."
The article said about this new breed of skinhead and cholo culture fusion, quote, "They've arrived in Hollywood to announce the end of punk rock."
Sad. And new gangs were emerging, like mid-city punks. And from the suburbs of the San Fernando Valley, Fight for Freedom, or FFF. And, according to Frank, murder became relatively commonplace. If anyone looked at you sideways or accidentally bumped into you, they could be ruthlessly attacked and stabbed to death.
The moon
Youngblood got out of juvie, and he and Frank jumped in a new member, a young punk they called Chemo because he looked like a cancer patient, as well as a mentally challenged kid named Storming Norman. He was only allowed in the gang because he'd attempted to hack his parents to death with a machete, and they were now a unit causing utter mayhem.
Frank had basically dropped out of school, just didn't go at all. But then Frank's mother moved to South Whittier, and Frank, who was now 15, started at Frontier High, continuation school for dropouts.
88% of the school was said to be gangbangers, East LA lowrider gangs like Whittier Vario Locos, Brown Brotherhood, Whittier 13, East Side Dukes, Los Nietos, and Pico Nuevo, to name a few.
Frank, Youngblood, Stormin' Norman, and a kid named Degenerate all attended this school. But since they were all punk rockers or skinheads, the other gangs didn't see them as a threat and let them be. It appears that was the thing with punk rock gangs. The older, established gangs didn't view them as rivals, just a weird novelty. The punk rock gangs basically just fought with each other.
At Frontier High, Frank recruited a guy named Silence and another named Bear into his clique.
And as the scene grew more notoriously violent, the police began an effort to destroy the scene using Gestapo tactics. When the Exploited played Mendiola's Ballroom, the cops raided the place, wearing gas masks, swinging billy clubs, spraying the hall down with mace.
Outside, the police stood in riot gear, beating the kids as they poured out, throwing one girl right through the ticket window.
Despite the uncalled-for violence from law enforcement, a newscaster reported,
"Once again, our brave police restore order after marauding punkers do their best to destroy property and terrorize the public. When will we see an end to this punk menace? When will the parents get control of the destructive kids?"
Los Angeles became a police state for the punk rock underground, with certain bands being targeted and singled out. Black Flag in particular, when they would play shows, police would just line up outside in riot gear, inspiring the song Police Story, the lyrics of which state,
"Fucking city is run by pigs. They take the rights away from all the kids. Understand that we're fighting a war we can't win. They hate us, we hate them. We can't win."
Chapter 7, 1983, A Year of Carnage.
At a Corpus Delicti show in a warehouse, Frank and his LMP brethren got into a gang fight with both Circle One and Southgate punk members. An LMP member, Bear, cracked a CGP member over the head with an axe handle, giving him permanent brain damage.
At a Florentine Garden show, a mid-city skinhead challenged Frank to a fight, so he stabbed him with his butterfly knife.
At the Offbeat Club in Hollywood, Boxer got into a fight with a ska kid who hit him in the neck with a steel rod, and Frank, Boxer, Joker, and Santino chased him down an alley, stabbing him several times and beating him with a bat and hammer, killing him.
Two new LMP members, Shit Dick and the Governor, murdered a pimp on Hollywood Boulevard for kicks and tossed his body in a dumpster, all while Frank was frying on acid and bugging out.
One night strolling down Hollywood Boulevard, Frank, Shit Dick, and Stormin' Norman passed a parking garage where a homeless man was having a psychotic episode, throwing bottles and screaming. They stabbed him to death. As Frank says,
Stabbing was becoming as easy as hitting a pitch.
now the gang found a new means of making money, mugging kids for their leather jackets and boots. When the Misfits played the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, LMP member Popeye, a complete psycho who'd just been released from prison, went around taking whatever he wanted. Leather jackets, Doc Martens, creepers.
And reading that, man, it made me so fucking sad because the Misfits are one of my absolute favorite bands. And the idea of going to see them and being mugged, man, it just fucking sucks. Growing up in Baltimore, I saw skinheads steal boots from kids they thought were posers and didn't deserve them. I fucking hated that shit. And I never wore Doc Martens because of it. I just wore cheap combat boots from the Army surplus store. I was scared to wear Doc Martens because I guess I was a poser, just a skater from the suburbs. But I was what they called a peace punk back then and wore green laces signifying such, which I still do to this day, though I'm no longer afraid to wear Doc Martens.
Chapter 8. Welcome to 1984.
Hardcore reached a fever pitch in Los Angeles when Golden Voice Productions began holding punk shows at the Grand Olympic Auditorium, a boxing and wrestling arena built way back in 1924, and crowds leapt from the hundreds and into the thousands. Utterly legendary shows where there'd be two swirling pits converging and separating, a sea of bodies flying from the stage.
During the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, the streets were cleaned and cleared of undesirables, especially in Hollywood, where the homeless, punk rockers, sex workers, and gangbangers were all pushed off the streets and persona non grata.
It was a tense time. The police presence was huge, and when Golden Voice held an international punk festival to celebrate the Olympics, punks from everywhere came together.
From Holland, there was BG. From Italy, Raw Power. From Finland, Rice Taita. Mexico's Solution Mortale. And the festivities were headlined and the United States represented by New York City's Reagan Youth and San Francisco's Dead Kennedys.
Every gang from Hollywood to the beaches and from Orange County to the Valley was there, all representing Hollywood Rat Patrol, Mickey Mouse Club, South Bay Skins.
Frank says that he and LMP stood on the far central end of the pit, the Los Angeles Death Squad on one side of them and the Suicidals on the other. It was tense, but apparently in the spirit of the Olympics or something, they didn't fight, just represented, though the pit was said to be one of the most violent ever.
Later, though, at another show, Frank claims that LMP member Pineapple Head knocked Mike Muir of suicidal tendencies out with a single punch in the parking lot, and said that Mike Muir couldn't fight and was a, quote, mama's boy. Frank also said the same thing, basically, about Mike Ness from Social Distortion, though both Mike Muir and Mike Ness have tremendous reputations as being street fighters. I mean, I don't know. I'm a huge fan of Mike Ness, though. I love his rockabilly style. And I remember him being famous for being able to knock a person out with a single punch.
But Mike Muir was actually trying to move his band away from the gang image at this point, saying in an interview that his band wasn't a gang, distancing himself from the violence, as they'd found some commercial success in a wild turnaround.
Yeah, it's crazy. In 1982, Flipside magazine readers voted Suicidal Tendencies the worst band and biggest assholes of the Los Angeles scene. But just a year later, they were voted the best band, and their self-titled album became a bona fide hit. branching out beyond the little punk underground and into the mainstream. The video for the song Institutionalized was all over MTV. You could hear kids everywhere going, "All I wanted was a Pepsi, and she wouldn't give it to me. Just one Pepsi."
Suicidal tendencies were even on the television show Miami Vice, and the song Institutionalized was featured on the Repo Man soundtrack.
Repo Man has such an awesome soundtrack. One of my favorite movies. The acoustic version of When the Shit Hits the Fan by the Circle Jerks, fucking amazing. And you have to give them mad credit. Suicidal Tendencies was one of the first bands to cross over to speed metal, soon followed by DRI and Corrosion of Conformity. This sound forging bands like Slayer and Metallica. Times were ever changing. What had been punk became hardcore, and now hardcore was becoming thrash metal.
And new sociopaths were joining LMP, the aptly named Mongo, who at just 16 was 6'5" and 260 pounds, and pissed Chris, who shaved not only his head bald, but his eyebrows, giving him an otherworldly and terrifying look.
And now, just completely psychotic, they spend their time driving through the suburbs, looking for a nice random family eating dinner in their home, then throw a crowbar or lead pipe through their window, showering them in broken glass.
Chapter 9. Frank the Shank.
One Sunday afternoon, Santino came to Frank and declared him second in command, the underboss of LMP, and he was given the title Frank the Shank.
And Frank the Shank now had his own car, a '69 Chevy.
By this time, newcomer Mongo had numerous assault charges, weapon charges, been on probation, had left victims in hospitals, and then Mongo got in a fight with a group of men at a house party, and when they jumped him, he started stabbing them, killing 2 of them. The blood so thick it was carrying leaves down the street. Homicide detectives thought Frank the Shank might have been in on it as well, though Frank says he had an ironclad alibi.
But then Mongo's dad, Stinky Ed, started showing up and sticking his nose where it didn't belong, appearing on Stink Dick's doorstep and asking questions, snooping around.
What a sentence. that is some sentence right there. Apparently, Stinky Ed himself had been a convicted murderer as well, but was released from prison on a technicality, and he was hoping to somehow do the same for his son. In the end, tough Frank the Shank wondered if his father would do the same, or even care at all if he went to prison.
New gangs appeared, like Norwalk insane punks, who were real trouble. Rumbles abounded, until Frank claims he and pissed Chris attempted to murder their leader, stabbing him and putting him in the ICU, ending the gang.
And as is the way with escalating violence, soon knives weren't enough, and guns were becoming involved.
A guy named Mad Manny from the old-school Chicano CV3 gang was released from the joint, covered in prison tattoos. 6'2" and 270 pounds, ripped from years of working out in prison. And he started going to punk shows with Frank the Shank. Mad Manny was also a gun nut with an arsenal of weapons.
Mad Manny had an AK-47 he'd take out and shoot, scaring the piss out of the neighbors, sometimes firing at random cars he thought may be stalking him.
The entire scene was splintering and changing at this point. As hardcore evolved into ultraviolent skinhead gangs, more peaceful lovers of dark, moody music fled, determined to start something new. And this is where you see the rise of goth, or as they called it then, snuff rock and graveyard music. Bauhaus, Sisters of Mercy, Sex Gang Children, Jesus, and Mary Chain.
And hardcore bands were evolving and changing in bizarre ways. The Misfits broke up, and Glenn Danzig started Samhain, or Samhain, whatever, how you want to pronounce it, which was heavier, but slower and more moody, less melodic. Black Flag had slowed into a morbid dirge with jazz influences. Henry Rollins, who'd started off as a skinhead, had grown his hair out long and now gave poetry readings. 7 Seconds went soft and tried to sound like U2. Gangrene went hair metal, which was the hot thing in LA at that moment, with bands like Motley Crue taking over the Sunset Strip.
Meanwhile, Frank and Mad Manny, plunging the depths of depravity, decided to rob a crack dealer, going up to a random dealer on the street. Frank stabbing the guy in the gut repeatedly, and Manny shooting him with a .22 Ruger, emptying his pockets and coming up with $400 and a bunch of crack.
A band down in Orange County that was making a strong following by putting on free shows at a park on Sunday nights was Pig Children. And Frank Santino and the governor all decided to go down there and give it a look-see.
At the Pig Children show in the park, Frank and Santino started swinging punches in the pit. And of course, a fight broke out.
So Santino slashed a guy's chest open with a box cutter, yelling, "LMP, want some? Get some."
No fun, just a bummer time, and on warm Southern California Sunday night.
Apparently, the whole place started attacking them, 30 strong. So Frank the Shank stabbed the guy in the liver with his butterfly knife before getting to the car and making it away.
Chapter 10. It all comes to a head.
Frank and Santino were arrested for attempted murder, assault and battery, and mutual combat. Bail was set at $100,000 each, and 10% of that needed to be put up in cash to a bondsman. And Santino's father, the Godfather, bailed him out.
When Frank called his father, hoping he might do the same, his dad told him to go to hell. But the way Frank saw it, and this is a quote, "If you shovel shit at the circus, you can't complain about the smell."
Baby, where I'm going, I won't need anything. 'Cause baby, where I'm going,
I do like that one. That's really good.
But then apparently the underboss of the Los Angeles Mafia, who owes his father, gets the charges dropped somehow.
Yeah, in a surprising turn of events, Frank the Shank's father came to the rescue and had the underboss of the Italian Mafia get the attempted murder charges against his son dropped.
Which leads us to the question, how true is the story Frank tells us in the book, Disco is Out, Murder is In?
Well, if you go on Reddit, you can find people denying it. Like user Fragrant Blood 2760, who says, "All I can say is this fucking legend surrounding La Mirada punks is hilarious. It's revisionist history at its most flagrant. They were not notorious. nor were they the most dangerous punk gang. I mean, if you knew how far from the truth that was, you wouldn't know whether to laugh or groan. LMP were soft as baby shit. Everyone in that general area, North Long Beach, Norwalk, Bellflower, Lakewood, Paramount, back then knew it. Now, I wasn't from La Mirada, but I lived there for a time, and I went to El Camino Continuation School for a bit. I ran into some LMPs. I actually had a couple friends that were with Belcher Street, and while they did their best to act large inside La Mirada, they rarely ventured out. They were terrified of the lads, suicidals, and everyone else. They were on the level of Lakewood punks. If they caught you in their neighborhood and they had the numbers, they would stomp you. Otherwise, they hid out in their own garages and backyards. Leave it to the person writing his own history book to embellish things. But trust me, nobody was worried about LMP back then. If you want an actual notorious gang, one that was actually dangerous and actually feared, it starts with the Southside LA Death Squad and moves on from there. The lads were deep.
And user Druff Mall echoed the sentiment, saying,
I got into punk in 1982, born and raised in Fullerton, just a few miles from La Mirada. Knew several people from there. My first girlfriend was from there. Anyway, as a young punk getting my feet wet in the scene, there were always older heads kind of patronizing me with advice. They'd tell me, don't fuck with the lads. Don't fuck with the family. Don't fuck with Circle One. Don't fuck with FFF. Don't fuck with pig children. But nobody ever said jack shit about LMP.
The original post was made by a Los Angeles Death Squad member named Lurch, going under the Reddit handle Hemicrusher, and user RemarkableFix5609 asks Lurch,
Is Frank a real guy or a composite of a bunch of people or something? The stories in that book seem like a bunch of made-up tall tales that a high school kid would tell. Tons of supposed murders in that book that are in no way substantiated.
And Lurch says, I like your take.
Remarkable Fix 5609 responds, It's surprising no one has called out the guys who wrote that book then. Do you know, though, is there an actual Frank?
There was no answer.
So, is Frank the Shank real? Well, I have no fucking idea. Honestly, he seems real to me. There's actual pictures of him in the book. It's labeled nonfiction, so I'm guessing yes? Is everything in his memoir real? Well, I kind of doubt it. There's no statute of limitations on murder. And with today's armchair sleuths, saying you murdered a homeless man in a parking lot for kicks is a sure way of getting yourself busted. I tried to find evidence of some of the crimes, in particular the stabbing at the Pig Family show, but I came up empty-handed. If anyone can point me in the right direction, though, and find some old newspaper articles somewhere, I'd be most appreciative. Reach out at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. But in my research, I also read another book that I really think we should mention, Safety in Numbers, My Journey with LA Punk Rock Gangs by Adam Wilson.
Adam Wilson was born in New York City and came from a broken home and mixed-race parents. His father was African American, his mother white and of Irish descent. When he was 4, he moved to Los Angeles with his father, Lyle Wilson, who was an actor.
And you horror movie lovers might remember having seen his father, for he played the doctor in Brian De Palma's movie Sisters. He was also in numerous television shows, including That's My Mama, Hugh Grant, and Sanford & Son. Actors Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman were good friends with the family.
Adam grew up in Hollywood and was incredibly rebellious. Like Frank, he discovered punk rock at a very young age, listened to Rodney on the rocks, and hung out on the streets of Hollywood, including the Hotel Hell Squat and Okie Dog.
Like Frank, Adam went from a street punk kid and juvenile delinquent to a skinhead, joined a punk rock gang for protection, eventually becoming an actual gangbanger. But unlike Frank, Adam was an empathetic kid, often deeply troubled by the violence he saw, especially the gay bashing, which he realized had caused many of the first-generation punks to leave the scene, and it sickened him.
Mostly, Adam went out of his way to avoid confrontation and violence. He loved the music and the weird friends he made. He loved dancing and stage diving, and he loved being a punk rocker and freak. Violence was just something he was forced to accept as part of the scene, but wanted no part of.
He fell pretty deeply into drugs and alcohol, gangbanging becoming a way of life for him. There was something about it never sat well with him. He enjoyed the brotherhood, but abhorred the senseless violence, which there was a lot of. And he numbed himself with crystal meth and hard alcohol.
Eventually, he got sober, joined AA, and moved out into the desert to the town of Indio, 20 miles outside Palm Springs, started attending College of the Desert, and became a writer.
Reading Adam's memoir was quite refreshing. There was none of the bravado and macho callousness. Instead, the tale was told with sensitivity, compassion, and regret. Unfortunately, Adam died on September 9th, 2021.
As for old Frank the Shank, he says,
I admit my part in ruining the scene. LA punk stood to be a magical moment of youth expression like no other, and gangs ruined punk rock. I still have people telling me they quit punk because of LMP. Today, I dig graves at a small cemetery just outside Los Angeles. Plots and plots of quiet reminders. What else would you expect from Frank the Shank?
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Frank the Shank and the punk rock gangs of 1980s Los Angeles. Thank you so much for listening.
And we have to thank some of the amazing bands kind enough to let us feature their music. There's links to them in the show notes. Please check them out. We got some old school hardcore from Alabama with Skeptic, and 3 Humboldt County, California punk rock bands, Cult of Indifference, Something Wicked, and Brain Dead Rejects. We got show favorite Donkey Cock, the always amazing and soulful Halizna, Cellophane Sam, Gag Me Sharkoff, Mosgrov, and Pipsqueak. And do you have some music you'd like featured? You got a story you'd like us to cover? Just want to say hi? Have some pertinent information you want to share? Drop us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you next week.
See ya then.